Back in 2013, I decided to take my blog, Femgineer, and transition it into a business, an education company. And I thought this would be a great time to do a website redesign. Now, I had redesigned a lot of websites and a lot of products, so I felt pretty good. I figured it would take about 3 weeks and that I had an extensive network of designers and developers to pull from. So I started by hiring a designer to help me with the redesign. And then I hired a developer to implement a WordPress plugin to make it easy to maintain. Then I got started on working on the wireframes for the redesign. And I handed them off when I was done to the designer. When I checked in a week later, the designer said that the design wasn't ready and they needed an additional week. So I said that was fine. I checked in again a week later. Still needed one more week. The third time I checked in, the designer told me that they needed to move across the country and no longer had time for my project. I was now in a lurch and I had to hire a new designer, someone who could see the project to completion. I finally got the designer that I needed and could help me. And once the designs were done, I handed them to my developer to start implementing. Then I asked the developer to see a demo once the plugin was ready. And I noticed that as I was looking through the demo, things weren't working quite right. There were small things like buttons were not quite doing the interactions that I wanted. And so I asked to see the code base. And when I looked into it, it was just a mess. I finally had to ask the developer up front, do you know how to do a WordPress plugin? They came clean and said, no, they thought this would be a great project to take on to learn how to do it. And that's when I had to go and basically hire a new developer. So the original project that I thought was going to take 3 weeks was no longer going to hit that deadline. And I had so many things going on at the time. I had to not only hire a new developer, I was also trying to teach and speak and write a new book. As a result, my 3-week estimate was not only wrong, but I was stuck with a runaway redesign. And it ended up taking me 12 months to finally do the full redesign. I was kind of embarrassed at the end, and I learned my lesson. You're probably dealing with a design as well or considering a redesign. And so in today's talk, I want to share with you how to avoid this runaway redesign. Hi, I'm Freemium Shankar. I was formerly the founding engineer of Mint.com, and I had helped launch, scale, and eventually was involved in the acquisition in 2009. After the acquisition, I transitioned to being the founder of BusyBee, a CRM solution for fitness businesses. And I am currently the founder of Femgineer, an education company dedicated to helping techies like yourselves build products, companies, and level up in your career. I've also been an entrepreneur in residence at 500 Startups, a lead mentor in residence at Techstars, a lecturer at Duke University, and authored 2 books, How to Transform Your Ideas into Software Products and Present, A Techie's Guide to Public Speaking. If you enjoy my talk today, I highly recommend you check out my web show, Build, which you can find on my YouTube channel. Now, I'm going to be mentioning a lot of resources as I speak, and don't worry, I'll make sure that you get the links to them. So with that, let's get back to the topic. One of the big questions that comes up as people are evaluating a redesign is, why can't we just design the right solution from day one? Well, here's the challenge. Often when we start working on a product, it's a prototype, a proof of concept, something quick and dirty that we want to get into the hands of maybe a few customers that have a very specific persona. So we're not thinking through all of the nuances. And then there comes a time where business goals change and we want to go after a new customer, or we need to address more customer needs. And that means redesigning the product. And finally, we're in tech where things move pretty quickly and things are constantly in flux. So you may need to keep up with these trends, such as a responsive website, keeping up with web standards, or making your product more accessible for users. Now, in today's talk, I'm going to provide you with a framework to evaluate when a design is good enough. Because yes, there is a time where a design is good enough and you don't necessarily need to do a redesign. If you choose to, I'll talk about some of the things that you need to consider redesigning, because it's not just about your product, even though I know this is Product Summit. And the third is that you want to think about what spurs a redesign, because a lot of times these come up because of a changed environment. And the fourth and final is those gotcha moments. I want to share them with you so that you know what to be wary of, and if and when they come up, you'll be able to manage them. Now, a few caveats before we get started. I'm not giving you the gospel. This is my experience, so it's not foolproof. And there's going to be more that you have to consider based on your industry, based on your company, as well as the size and scale that your design is going to be impacting in terms of users. So understand that this is a process, and it's going to give you a high-level understanding of the things to think about when you decide to consider a redesign. Now, the first question that I want you to think about is the design ever good enough? Turns out, yes, there is. And that's when it's meeting business goals, when your product is meeting business goals. A great example of this is the company Olar. If you're not familiar with them, they provide a live chat widget, which you may have seen on a number of websites that help people interact with their customers. And back in 2008, Olar started as a startup that was bootstrapping, and their main business goal was to hit profitability. As a result, they could not do a lot of product redesign, if at all any. They had to make do with what they had. And they said once they hit profitability, then they would consider doing a redesign. They were able to achieve that goal. The second is if you're getting a lot of feedback from customers. You want to dive in and figure out, is this a vocal minority of users? Because if it is, then you may decide to hold off on doing a redesign, with, of course, the understanding that some of these users may churn if they're not getting what they need. The next is if you're in a highly regulated market, such as healthcare, or one where your designs have to be approved before you can get the product in the hands of customers. In that case, you might want to hold off on doing multiple redesigns. The fourth and final is if there's going to be a cost to the customer. For example, if you are providing a product to enterprise companies that are using it for their employees are using it, then anytime you do a workflow change or a design change, that means their employees or people who are using it are going to have to relearn or be retrained on this. And that can get expensive very quickly in terms of time. So these are all some reasons why you might decide to hold off on doing a redesign and that your product is good enough. So let's switch gears and talk about what are some things that you want to redesign. The first is a landing site. And the reason I say landing site is because if you're operating a SaaS product, software as a service, or an online business, this is your front door. And people are going to come and they want to understand what your product does and the value proposition for them. And so you're going to need to think about redesigning this in addition to your product so that you keep up with the product changes. And finally, any additional experiences. This could be related to customer support or your sales team. And I'll dig into some examples as we continue. So let's talk about what spurs a redesign. The first is a change in management. Somebody at the top decides, hey, we need to do a redesign because we're going in a new direction or we need to revive the brand. A great example of needing to do a rebrand is when you want to show credibility. One company that did this recently, about 2 years ago, was Airbnb, where one of their business goals was design for trust. They wanted to show that they were no longer some small Silicon Valley startup and had grown up. And one of their core values was design for trust and build that trust with hosts and guests. So they decided to rebrand not only their product, but a lot of their marketing collateral as well. The third is if you're pivoting your business. You are maybe zooming in on a particular feature that is really the value of your product, or you decide to go multi-platform, or you want to perhaps attract a new set of users, or a new persona in terms of those users. The fourth is if you've built up a lot of product or tech debt. Product debt, if you're not familiar, is the debt that you accrue as you're working really quickly, implementing workflows, and you notice that they really aren't leading to any happy paths and things are starting to get a little crufty. The corollary to that is tech debt. And that's the code that gets quickly put in. These could be monkey patches, hot fixes, and just over time it starts to accrue and makes it really harder to do a redesign, much less, build any sort of features. So once you start to accrue a lot of this debt, then a redesign can help you pay that down. Next, if you see a drop in user adoption, and of course we care about users, right? And you can get a sense of if your users are not adopting your product by looking through some products like the analytics behind them. Some examples of this are Kissmetrics, Mixpanel, or Intercom. And finally, taking a multi-screen or multi-platform approach. A lot of products are starting to do this. And if this is the case for your product or your company, then you want to make sure that there's going to be a consistent experience or the interaction between these products makes sense for users. And if it doesn't, then that's going to spur a redesign. So let's talk about what you need to be wary of should you embark on this path. right? The first is a change in environment. If there's a huge reorg, if your company's growing really quickly, if there's a lot of people you're hiring, or maybe there's a lot of departures, it's not really a good time to embark on a redesign. Inevitably, what'll happen is the redesign will get put on the back burner, or it'll get scrapped altogether. Or worse yet, you'll end up with this kind of half-baked solution, which didn't really, help because now the redesign has no value. The second thing you want to think about is if there are too many things going on at once, right? Are you trying to change a whole lot in one iteration? And that's why it's important to start with some experiments, set a goal, and be clear about what the outcome of the redesign is. Now the third, and I know this might be self-evident, is redesigning the wrong thing. I'm still going to mention it as a cautionary tale. You really need to think through what your customer needs are. And this goes back to taking a look at anecdotal evidence as well as your analytics. Now the fourth is new technology or language. We all want to adopt cutting edge technology and stay ahead of the curve. Unfortunately, if we are too ahead of the curve and the technology doesn't have staying power, then it means having to do a lot of rework. A classic example of this is Flash. Remember when everybody wanted to implement that slick interaction only to then experience a lot of companies saying they weren't going to support it, and that meant having to redesign websites. So if you have limited resources, it may make sense to wait and see what technology has staying power before you decide to adopt it as part of your redesign. Now the spillover effect is a learning curve. Anytime your teammates, your company, your employees needs to learn a new technology or language, that means they're gonna have to take the time to learn it, to implement it, to understand its nuances. And this is often where that last 20% of any project or redesign ends up really being 80%. So let's start by digging in a little bit deeper and talking about redesigning, starting with your landing site. And the reason I say landing site again is this is your front door. In a lot of companies, the marketing team is the one responsible for managing the upkeep and maintenance of the landing site. So it's important to invite the marketing team to be part of the discussion of a redesign. You don't want to have silos. You don't want to wait until the product is done for them to update the marketing site. And as you're going through these conversations, think about the goals. What are they? Is it conversion, going from an initial prospective user to monetizing them? Could it be credibility, again, going from being a startup to a bigger company? Or is it that competition has slowly creeped in and you really need to position yourself and differentiate yourself from those competitors? The third thing that you want to be careful of is not just redesigning the landing site and forgetting about the product. You see this a lot where there's a slick landing site and you click through and the product seems like it was built in the 90s or like early 2000s, right? You want to avoid doing this because it then means that your redesign didn't really help you achieve your business goal. So make sure that the landing site and the product are kind of in lockstep as you are considering your redesign. And today, people are discovering our products from a lot of different channels. And so one of the things that companies are doing are experimenting with microsites. These are just single landing pages with some different types of value propositions, testing out what is resonating with users. And then based on the microsite feedback, the companies will take and put this into their overall landing site. I will say if you're going to build these microsites, either turn them off or make sure to account for increases in maintenance time if they're going to stick around. The next thing you want to think about are the content on the sites, because some of it might have gotten outdated. This could be blogs, this could be helps or facts. What do you need to revisit and revamp so that it stays up to date with the upcoming product changes? And finally, I know people always cringe when I say search, but let's face it, SEO is a big part of people discovering our SaaS product or our online business. So we want to keep up with the current standards and make sure that it is searchable. So let's dive into an example. Again, going back to Olark, the live chat company, this was their website a couple years in. And by looking at this website, it's clear what they do. They provide a live chat widget. You can see the example of the widget here. And they've got a clear call to action, as well as what it is, the value proposition. Your customers, they want to chat with you. However, Olark got into a little bit of a bind that caused them to consider a redesign. The first was that there was a lot of competition in the space. And as that competition came in, they needed to figure out how they could decide how they could differentiate themselves. And I thought, but they also wanted to humanize the experience to make it show that this is interactions with customers. And finally, they wanted to build more credibility. They were no longer a Silicon Valley startup. They were servicing thousands of customers around the globe. They wanted to make that clear. So let's take a look at how the design changed. Here's the newly designed site. And immediately what grabs you are these human faces, right? This is, after all, chat. You're talking to customers. If you look at the bottom, you'll see 3 metrics. You and I might consider these vanity metrics, but for a customer evaluating Olark, it's important that they see that Olark has over 12,000 customers, is in 178 countries, and is capable of dealing with a large volume or scale of chats, over 1 million in a day. Now, right in the middle, you'll see Olark is ready for GDPR. They included this because of the increase in data privacy in Europe, especially for prospective customers or customers in the US who might be serving people who are in Europe. This redesign helped them do a lot. It helped them rebrand themselves, it helped them build trust with customers, and it helped them attract new prospects. Now let's switch gears and talk about redesigning a product, because this is Product Summit. Remember in the beginning, I talked about transitioning a prototype. And a lot of times this happens when you accrue tech debt and product debt. Again, tech debt is that code-based debt, and product debt are those workflows and all the sort of clunky interactions that people experience. As you're going through and you're thinking about redesign, remember, you want to have a consistent user experience across platforms. And you want to take into consideration anecdotal evidence, either through surveys or customer support tickets, as well as analytics by looking into products that you might have, such as Kissmetrics, Mixpanel, or Intercom. I'm going to say one controversial thing. If it's going to be a lot of work to do paying down tech debt and product debt, you might want to scrap your prototype and start fresh, knowingly that you are going to need to then migrate the data. This may end up saving you a lot of time and energy. One more controversial thing, if features aren't supporting your users or if people aren't using them, it's okay to take them away. You'll end up saving a lot of time in terms of maintenance and in terms of engineering and product design. And then again, remember, there's going to be a learning curve for users, especially those who are using your product for their own business goals, like your enterprise customers. So you want to consider how you're going to onboard them or retrain them. And a great way to do this is through usability testing to make sure you're hitting those happy paths and meeting your customer needs. This, of course, necessitates starting with a top-down approach for doing the redesign, taking a look at all the aspects of the product. As I mentioned before, you're also going to want to take a look at these additional experiences. This could be customer support. A lot of times customer support teams have workarounds or have major issues that they're dealing with. And so taking a look at them and considering how you want to redesign your product to accommodate them is a good step, and inviting them to participate in those conversations when you're doing the redesign. The second is sales teams. As you're getting ready to offer new features, were there certain features that the sales team was trying to get you to adopt so that they could get more customers, right? This might be a great time to incorporate some of those features or consider doing a redesign if the features were not being adopted or helping with user adoption. Now, I know this word customer journey is either one that people love or hate. Personally, I think it's important to map out the customer journey so that you know what the end goals are, you know what the interactions are, you know what experience you want to provide your customers. And yes, it takes time, but it will end up saving you a lot of time because it'll help you scope out your project. Okay, when I say this, I know people, after all of what I've told you, you're probably thinking, okay, tell me that this means that I'm going to have a successful redesign. Well, I have some good news and some bad news for you. Let's start with the bad news, right? Anytime you do a redesign, there's going to be people who are not going to like it. They're going to get up in arms about it. A great example of this was in 2006 when Facebook introduced the news feed. But there were so many users who were like, what is this? Why are they doing this? And Facebook had to take a lot of flack for this. I remember talking to some of the customer support people who said, wow, I am so inundated. However, after a while, things settled down and it became normal business for them. And so much so that they were able to go on to attracting hundreds of millions of users. Another example, again, is Airbnb, where when a couple years ago, they went down this rebranding path, people are like, why are they doing this? What's wrong? Product works, right? Again, their business goal was design for trust and establish that with both guests as well as hosts. And they stuck by that and made sure they were consistent about messaging the need for this rebrand, both in marketing collateral as well as in PR. So coming back to the good news, is it possible to have a successful redesign? I would say absolutely. And part of that success is starting with an experiment. One of my go-to resources is Jake Knapp's book, Sprint, because it provides a very simple way to get started. You take 5 days, you pull everybody that needs to participate, different teams, you start with one feature, and you start to work through that so that people understand what's involved. You also start to notice how scope can creep out. You might notice knowledge gaps in your team. So there's a lot that happens in those 5 days. I highly recommend, if you're going to consider doing an experiment, to consider this framework in addition to what I provided you with today. So let's wrap things up, right? I started by giving you this entire framework. Go slow. Think about what are the various pieces. Take a top-down approach. Make sure you set some business goals that your redesign is trying to achieve. And finally, manage the expectations for your team as well as the other teams that you're going to be interfacing with. Sales, marketing, and customer support. And there may be more. And of course, you know that there is a point where design is good enough. If you decide that you want to do a redesign, make sure you consider the landing page, the product, as well as those additional experiences. And be wary of when there may be a time that the redesign is going to come up in conversation. And finally, I've shared some more stories so that you can see for yourself how redesigns can become runaway redesigns, and hopefully yours won't, because now you've been armed with a number of tools and a number of different techniques so that you can spot these gotcha moments and manage them as they come up. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can tweet at Purnima. I've also included a copy of my ebook. Again, I will make sure that you have links to this, and here are some additional resources. Thanks for listening, and happy redesign.